Hey, welcome to Dive into World Building. We're back. Hey, and Cliff is here, even better. So we're getting a little bit of a late start today because, you know, it's just hard to get back into those routines of life after a break. But I am so glad that you're all here. And I'm just really excited about Dive into World Building this year. I want to make sure before we start into our topic that I remind anybody who might watch the show later that Dive into World Building has a special deal with Writing the Other for the next Writing the Other Masterclass session, where registration ends on January the 27th. So if you are a past discussant, guest, or patron of Dive into World Building, you can get $40 off the Writing the Other Masterclass if you use the code Dive into WB, DIVEINTOWB. So I'm going to leave that there. I have like links and other stuff sitting all over my social media. So if you need more specifics, you can always go look. There's an announcement on my Patreon as well. But anyway, wanted to let everybody know that because we're getting towards, you know, coming up towards January 27th. I want to get that out of the way. Anyway, today's topic is expectations of age. I think it was Kat who suggested it because Kat has lots of ideas, and they are excellent ideas. So there we are. Yeah, I don't know. I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about whether age meant people who were older or whether it just meant what expectations we have of people at different ages. Because I think that the things play out very differently depending on how we interpret the word age. Thoughts?
I think that, I don't remember what context I said this in. Somebody will probably go back now through all the prior world buildings, and if I said it on air, somebody will chime in helpful and go, well, actually, she said it when. But meanwhile,
you know what? I don't care what you said.
Partly, I was thinking about what we think aging is supposed to be like for people who are reaching latter stages of life, but also, yes, what do we think is an appropriate age for various activities, and how do we think that that process works? Because it's very culturally specific, but within a culture, it can be very difficult to see that it's not just intrinsic, because that's we make true. It into something that's so encoded and embedded.
And gendered.
Very gendered.
Very, very deeply gendered. So
and in a multicultural, multiracial society, it is also racialized.
Yes.
And it is also class-based. And so yes. There's nothing it doesn't touch on.
Nope. It's a very intersectional idea.
Despite the fact that all of us experience it. But it's very colored. And I think that, I don't know how much I would have said about this when I was younger, but I am looking at looming milestone birthdays and definitely having the sorts of thoughts that one does when one participates in the sort of decade-based big number birthdays
system. Yeah. It always, you know, I think it's tied into our concept of the, you know, the decimal system. And
we're very decimal.
Those big
we believe
zeros,
decimal.
They loom large.
I want to coin the term decimality. In fact, I might use that in something, because I'm like, you know, we are very tens based, and we act like being tens based is the only way to go, and then we disregard the 12s in our lives, the 12s and the 60s. So
yeah, except when we're talking about time, but yeah.
Well, but bringing it back to aging, if you are in an East Asian context, then your aging is in 12-year cycles.
Yeah.
So, you know, first turn through the zodiac, second turn through the zodiac, third turn. And so we are very conscious about how far we're going through this, and that, you know, that you only get so many, right? And
yeah.
And so, on the other hand, it's very clear to me that because of the context I grew up in, even though by heritage those 12s should matter to me, the 10s hit harder than the 12s. I don't know what's going to happen when they coincide at some point for me, but that too.
So Does that mean that there's a big deal at 60 when the 5 elements and the 12 signs line up?
I don't know. Maybe.
Well, I mean, so
we'll
much.
have to find somebody who's within not in the diaspora.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is very interesting because, I spend. So you guys know I teach in the mornings, and much of my time is spent telling kids that the things that they think and feel are going to escape through their language, right? In various different ways, and in the same way, these things, these expectations, they come into us and they get sort of built in our subconscious, and we're not necessarily aware of them until suddenly we're like, oh, I'm turning 40, or
Oh,
yeah.
I have just realized. I did not realize that what this word meant, because I'd only heard this word as a thing that my elders were facing or celebrating. And so, yes, in fact, in CJK cultures, the 60th birthday is a big thing.
Huh.
In Japanese, it's called Hanreki. I don't have the tone mark, so I'm going to butcher it in Chinese, and my Korean is abysmal, so I'm not going to try, but yes, it is important.
That makes sense. I never thought about it before, but that makes sense. So I grew up in the southern United States partly, and there were absolutely different behavioral expectations for young folks in terms of deference to elders that was habitual in the South and is not so in the East Coast where I grew up, or Chicago where I went to college, or out here, which is, you sir and ma'am everyone who's older than you. And you show deference to your elders in public, even if you know they're wrong about something, because it's a big deal to stand up to them and say, you're full of crap,
So I find it really interesting that you say that, Cliff, because I recognize it, and it's considered by Southerners to be a right and good thing about Southern culture, but I've also seen it in the same breath derided in other cultures that have a lot of age hierarchy by the same people who think that the Southern system is good. So it's really interesting to me how that gets racialized as well.
Sure. Well,
interesting.
When you start talking about sir and ma'am and deference, and you throw race into it in the South. That's obviously race trumps age.
Right.
So but
for people who don't know, who might be following along the webcast later, what Cliff is referring to, if I might be excused for barging in, is that in the Jim Crow South, Black men were never accorded any respect for age, and so they were always called boy, which was a way of infantilizing them, even while expecting them to have very adult manners. And so the Southern hierarchy is entirely race-based.
Yeah, although within any given race, it's age-based.
Yes.
Right. So even within African-American community in the South, you do the same kind of thing that I did to my white elders, right? Which is sir and ma'am and all that. And you don't talk back, and you don't sass your elders, that sort of thing, or you get in pretty big trouble.
Well, and I saw some discussion of this where some kid got caught between two sets of cultural expectations and was being given a hard time for calling somebody sir or ma'am. I can't remember what it was. Ma'am, I think. But anyway, so this stuff, even though it might seem on some surface levels to be arbitrary, it has very bad consequences. It has very real consequences, I should say, for people who are caught in the middle of that set of expectations.
What I'm going to note, just because we've gone down this path, is that one of the reasons why it becomes problematic outside of the context where that's normalized is, first of all, there are other cultures that put a lot of value in de-hierarchicalizing, at least making the the lip service toward de-hierarchicalizing. So there are cultures where children call adults by their first names, and that's considered a positive value.
Yeah.
And the other is that because of the current way we use honorifics in English, it's not possible to have an age-based deference, which is also not at the same time gendered.
Yes, yes.
So if you don't have a culture that sirs and ma'ams people, then you don't have to interrogate what their gender is. But if you are in a sir, ma'am, or bust culture, then you are really forced to know whether you should call somebody sir or ma'am. And in the absence of a deferential and respectful way of calling somebody, neither sir nor ma'am, now we've got a lot of emotional turmoil.
Yep, because you can't say yes or no without gendering the older person. It's right. Or being rude, one of those two things.
Well, right? And you may be rude anyway. Right?
Well, I mean, there are other languages where the hierarchy is embedded in the language, and you must know the hierarchy between you and the other person in order to be able to speak to them. So,
yeah.
I was thinking more about I was also thinking about the ways in which aging is very personalized and what we expect out of aging. Like, I hear people who are in their 30s saying, "Oh, I'm creaky, I'm getting older." And there are cultures where that's a normal thing to say. There are cultures where that's an abnormal thing to say. It's also, within the English-speaking verse, it is very subcultural. And also, what are you expected to be able to do as you get older? And are you expected to maintain plasticity of thought and habit as you get older? Or are you automatically expected to be calcified because you've gotten to a certain age? So
those are good questions.
I'm saying, really, you can't learn new things because, and what is the age cutoff? When do you start getting old? And I look at these pictures of people from the 1950s who are the calendar age that I am right now. And they look so much older to me than I and my peers are presenting. And, act grown up, act your age. All these things are really loaded.
Yeah.
Yeah, Diana Paxson said to me once that she was a guest of honor at a European convention. I forget where. But when she arrived, she found that people underestimated her age enormously because she didn't dress age appropriate for where she was.
Yeah.
She dressed the way she liked to dress, which they parsed as much younger.
Right.
And the people who did know her age were kind of their reaction was more or less, it wasn't negative, she said. It was more like, wow, that's even possible. I didn't know that was, that you could do what you're doing. It's amazing.
Right.
Kind of thing.
The other thing that happens there that's really interesting to me is that because this is really inadvertently timely, because in the time since we met last, the Facebook has currently had the 10 years ago and now profile picture meme going around. And one of my friends observed, because I had said, wow, some of us actually look younger now than we did 10 years ago. And what she had noted was partly, and somebody said, oh, it's because we've learned to take better selfies. Well, that is true. But the other thing that my friend noted, because we're all roughly part of an age cohort, is that our earlier pictures were taken when we were trying to look like we had more gravitas and trying to project more age, and so that we could take on more authority that might be denied to us by a certain sort of ageism against youth. And now that we are 10 years older, some of us are trying to look younger to escape the ageism that comes with being assumed to be old and decrepit or whatever else. And so our own pressures for how we present ourselves have shifted in that 10 years and done a complete reversal. So that's why we look younger, some of us. I thought that was really interesting and probably true.
It's an interesting thought.
That is interesting. That's so not my personal experience for the last 10 years, because I've learned a lot. That's an obvious thing. And I like to attribute it to my children, but it's also really just 10 years of chronological age.
Well, Cliff, if you shaved your beard, how much younger would you look?
I would look a lot younger because most of my gray is in the beard.
Given you and given what I know of you in person, I feel like it would shave off literally 20 years.
Yeah, probably. You know, but on the other hand, the only time it really sucks to be red as a little older is when I'm with my kids and someone, you know, so I say, can you take our picture? And someone say, oh, smile with grandpa, you know. And I've gotten grandpa several times.
Oh dear.
You know, so that's, you know, maybe a half dozen times in the 7 years I've been a parent.
Well, I mean, so we could head in that direction. Reading somebody else's age is very culturally different and is actually really hard to do, and also has a lot of pitfalls.
Sure. But the other reason I don't feel any pressure to, you know, dye my hair or shave the beard or do anything that would make me look younger is that I am male. Mm-hmm. And there are advantages for being red as an older white male. Mm-hmm. You know, and that's the disadvantages. I mean, it's, you know, like I'm not like, oh, I'm going to go be red as an older white male. I'm just like, I'm being lazy and not changing my appearance because I don't feel.
You have no incentive.
Right. I have no incentive to change my appearance because, or little, I mean, those grandpa remarks are like, but other than that.
Yeah. Well, you would
and I am like 10, 15 years older than most of the other parents that are, you know, my kids' age parents.
Don't dye the beard. You'll look like Evil Universe Cliff.
That's right. So I have had a goatee. I have sometimes had a goatee. Yep. Oh, speaking of kids, you're live on the air. Say hi. Say hi to Juliet. Hi. Say hi to Kat. Say hi to Che.
You know, I'm acquiring gray, but I've acquired just enough gray that I look like my plausible mistaken for age if I were not Asian. And people who are not Asian don't always know how to read the age on my face, so I don't look my age to them, which I find funny because our markers of aging are different.
Yep.
And it has to do with the way that our skin is distributed across our face, how subcutaneous fat works, how the drooping of musculature and all these other things work. So the things that we have normalized within this English-speaking post-Commonwealth or Commonwealth plus U.S. context, or the European context, pick one, is, because they all overlap, is based on this idea of Northern European aging. That the signs of aging are wrinkles at the corners of the eyes, wrinkles in the forehead, graying of the skin, overall general wrinkling, a little bit of sagging, jowliness. There are lots of things, and some of those are actually spread across populations, but also the age at which it hits is different. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes an issue of social justice for a lot of people when we are perceived as significantly older, significantly younger than our age, and it changes the way people expect us to behave or what we have accrued in our lives. Because I'm hearing people being, I mean, I get a huge amount of understanding about dealing with issues of precarity, for instance, because I'm assumed to be younger than I am. Mm-hmm. And I was just watching some boomer people within a community sort of being startled that the federal employees being furloughed and otherwise not paid are living paycheck to paycheck, and said, you know, what happened to having 6 months banked? And it was really an issue of their context was that was actually a reasonable expectation that people will be able to have that. I don't know anybody who is not actually wealthy in some way who has 6 months. There are people I know who have that, but they are also secure in multiple different directions. Mm-hmm. And so that's an expectation of milestones of adulthood that are no longer applicable because they're not achievable.
So I think a lot of the infantilization of millennials by older people has to do with those expectations of where millennials should be financially and in their career-wise, educationally, everything. Even having kids, like there was these panic articles about how we're in America, oh my God, the birth rate's declining. What could possibly be happening? Well, duh. It costs a lot of money to have a baby in a really dog-eat-dog capitalist society like ours, where there's no support. And I just love that Gavin Newsom in California is talking about 6 months of family leave for new parents of newborns. That's just that's wonderful dragging of the Overton window towards something more reasonable. Yep. Whether it takes place or not, at least it's being talked about. But that those attack hit pieces on millennials are all based on a kind of that scaled expectation from the post World War II time period of white people in America, and what white people were able to achieve post World War II after the New Deal and all that.
Yep.
I find it fascinating as somebody who came of age during one of the last great recessions before the ones we've been talking about, that the boomers are concerned about millennials who in many cases are their grandchildren, where they didn't actually seem to worry about Gen Xers. And constantly, as a Gen Xer, I am irritated that
nobody worried about us.
Right?
We're all Gen Xers, and we're like, "What, you guys?"
We were like,
it's like we never existed.
Why do you care about them?
Yeah, now like it went straight from boomers to millennials, and like here we are again.
And I'm sitting here going, "Hello, I exist," and here we are in that demographic trough, and we don't count. And again, it is also partly that I'm just looking and going, well, there were boomers in every single damn slot.
Yeah,
and then you all outvoted us and made sure that we didn't get any of the incentives we needed. So, and then they didn't get voted down. So now they're actually hitting people you care about. Well, that's nice to know. So yes, I might have a little Gen X chip on my shoulder about all that.
That's part of being Gen X, I mean.
Apparently, that's all we do is get resentful, right?
Yes. Well, we have a lot to be resentful. But yeah.
Well, we didn't succeed in killing anything like millennials.
Right, exactly. We didn't, but like then you get the fun double whammy of bi erasure and Gen X erasure, and
I'm currently having an interesting time talking about model minority erasure. So,
but let's use that. I'm going to segue. I'm going to be a very subtle segue. Let's talk about erasure of people of different ages, especially elder erasure, right? Because that really happens in our society in a big way that it doesn't in other societies, or all other societies. Some societies have it, and some don't.
So one of the interesting things is that now we are seeing boomers unable to maintain that sort of, no, really, I'm just an adult, as opposed to I'm old. And so there's a whole thing about suddenly there are lots of think pieces about what it means to be aging. And it used to be that older people were invisible because boomers didn't care about them.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. Sorry.
Sure, if you're over 30, you don't matter anymore.
Now you're going to get boomer hate mail. I'm so sorry.
I just want to state for the record that Boomer is one of my favorite characters in Battlestar Galactica.
Oh, yes, that makes it all better. Much love to my boomer friends who are mostly not like this.
Yeah, exactly.
Or they wouldn't be my friends.
Exactly.
But the thing is, there's a lot of the older people don't count did come from this very youth and teen obsessed culture that was about that demographic bump. And so I think what we're seeing now is that we do not actually intrinsically in the underlying culture have disregard of elderly, because there's always been you should pay attention to your elders going on. And then I keep hearing that elderly women are completely sidelined, but I suddenly, because I'm on the cusp of that now, like looking on at it, because in my generation, we're always looking at what the boomers are doing because they're always doing it before us and showing us how. Thank you, I think. There's media now about being an aging woman and what it means to be an aging woman, and about the sexuality of aging women, and all these things that I've been told don't exist. So the other thing, though, that I find interesting is that I am encountering millennials who do not have these prejudices about aging people and are not going, oh, so-and-so is over a certain number cutoff, so they are not eligible for me to consider. So people started talking about this as a cougar phenomenon, as if it was predation by older women. But as I observe this happening around me, I'm seeing a lot of pursuit by younger men who are wanting to latch on to a less turbulent time in this is in heterosexual, ostensibly monogamous pairings, time in a woman's life, which is a really interesting thing that culturally we're not addressing much, as if it doesn't exist. And so this is kind of a tree falling in the woods issue. Does it really exist? I don't know. Maybe I just have a weird sample.
Yeah, well, possibly.
But but most of it was coming from an older paradigm of old men being into young women. And now that it's becoming less and less socially acceptable, because I think that Gen Xers were accepting it, and I don't know that millennials really want much to do with boomer sugar daddies, because I think culturally they've become so different. Xers still understand boomers in a way that millennials, clearly, as I'm watching millennials and Gen Z kids around me, do not understand the world that boomers assume is normal.
Yeah, well, we kind of grew up in the wake of it. So
right?
Yeah.
Like, we still know how to dial a phone.
So I was recently,
phone?
like, for the first time in decades, literally, rewatched the movie Animal House. And what struck me in rewatching it in like 2016 is, here's a movie that was already a nostalgia piece. It was done 15 years after it was set. It was set in the early 60s, which is really like the late 50s, right? It was set before the whole revolution of the 60s, and looking back nostalgically on it. But now, looking at a movie filmed in like the late 70s about the early 60s, the technology difference between the current age and that age makes you have to know your history to understand how things work, like with telephones and telephone booths and when they went out on the date and they had to go to the dorm and like call up to the room and things like that. You know, it's now a historical piece, or kind of has a vibe of a science fiction piece, because it's so different in culturally. And oh my God, is that film misogynistic? But anyway, that I didn't notice in the 1970s.
Yeah,
right? And is like wince-worthy obvious now. What?
We just watched The Hunt for Red October.
Oh wow!
And that ends up being a very interesting sort of historical microcosm of American culture in a particular period.
Oh, come on, the Russians are the baddies again.
Yeah, that's true. Except if you're Republican.
Yeah, but I mean, why? So part of it though is watching Americans and Brits play Russians, and how they're portraying the Soviet mindset from an American perspective from the 80s. Yeah,
I mean, Scottish perspective.
On the other hand, I am going to note that many of the extras on the Red October were actually Soviet refugees.
Oh, that's interesting. And
I know this because I know some of the people who participate in that casting call. So there's a preponderance of Russian Jews in the background that oughtn't have happened.
Of course.
Wow.
Because they would not have been allowed on a nuclear submarine in that era. But there were actual Russian speakers and people of Russian, at least cultural heritage, in the backdrop.
So. Sure.
So
what I was mostly noticing was the was the way that things were written and but.
But speaking of aging in submarines, one of the fascinating things about Das Boot, if you've ever seen that, is what was considered old, right? The mortality rate for U-boat crews was so high that I think the captain, who's the character who's the captain, is about 26, and he's like ancient and really grizzled ancient, submarine commander, because he's in his late 20s and he hasn't been killed yet.
Yeah.
And so they have the whole age thing kind of crushed into a sedimentary layer between like 18 and 26. But it's real, right? Like the age differences are very real between people out on their first mission and someone who's managed to survive a bunch.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, all the World War II stories, right? The old men. But and also the World War I stories especially have a lot of that too, where the old man on the battlefield is actually quite young.
Yeah.
But again, I'm looking at the fact that, like, who is portraying old people in Hollywood now as compared to who was portraying old people in Hollywood when we were younger?
Yeah.
And old is different now.
Yeah, when we were younger, if you were really old, you wound up being God, like George Burns. Because
George Burns was legitimately old.
But he was playing a character who was at least thousands of years old.
But I mean, it's also really interesting that George Burns is somebody from the vaudeville era.
Yeah.
Who had made it through vaudeville and was not part of the silent movie era, but, remembered it really vividly. And now our things are being directed by people who only remember. I tried to tell a child that it was so exciting when the NBC Peacock was like revolving. That color, but I don't. I experience it, but I don't remember it. But
we had a black and white TV, so
when they made the Peacock revolve because we suddenly had computer graphics.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
it was amazing. And then there was also like the bug and the crawl on the bottom of the screen seemed so amazing.
Yeah.
I remember the owl at the opening of Labyrinth that was CGI, and it was like, is that real? Is that CGI? We couldn't tell, because it was so realistic.
and also stuff about like explaining MTV, and they're just looking and they're like, these are the YouTube generation, and my kids talk about, oh yeah, I want to be a YouTube star. That's their career goals, right? And I'm just thinking, this is not a job that existed in my childhood.
It's not a job that's going to exist by the time they grow up. It'll be something different.
I think that they are hoping to do it now. We're in negotiations. We are in
right
negotiations.
Now. Let's do it right now.
Well, you can tell them, Juliet, who is a legit YouTube star, right?
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, I get a lot of mileage with my students when I tell them that I have a YouTube show. They're like, what? I'm like, it's not the kind of show you would want to watch, but that's okay.
Still YouTube.
No, they might.
Actually, to be fair, one of my students has actually checked out the show.
What did he think? Or she?
Thought it was, quote, interesting, unquote. He did sound like he wasn't completely insincere.
What does their show consist of? Well, we pick a topic, ignore it, and then be a bunch of Gen Xers fetching about millennials and boomers. No.
Well, that is definitely this might be the most meta show we've ever done in that case. So
I wanted to see. I wanted to see if we could go into the arena of fiction for a bit, because we've been doing a lot of reality, and I think we do a lot of that on the show, and I don't have any problem with it, because honestly, when I think about all the wrinkles of reality, it gives me ideas for fiction. But let's see if we can talk explicitly about what it means to age in fictional settings.
Well, I know all the stat changes that occur to Dungeons and Dragons characters in first edition when they get older.
Oh, okay. So you have to work out stat changes in D&D.
Yeah, you lose dex and strength and constitution, but you gain wisdom. Anyway.
If only.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's why it's fantasy role playing, Kat.
Well, I mean, so you have, you know, I'm looking around, and we definitely have this sort of wise old man stereotype, or I guess you could call it a trope, right? Wizards and their ilk.
Can we talk about the fact that we've gone from being a culture that expects old people to be wise to a culture that expects old people to be clueless?
Oh, well, yeah, that's definitely interesting.
Really, seriously, when is the last time you saw somebody old being portrayed as wise in real life?
Well, Dumbledore, right? I mean, but
Dumbledore's
also
real life? Dumbledore's real life?
Well, okay, I saw it in real life. I saw it, but it's like a.
Well, old as wise versus old as foolish. I mean, I think.
Right.
Trying to think of the last.
I think they both coexist.
I saw with someone old that wasn't SF.
I mean, because at a certain point, you do become foolish as you get old, right?
That's but we're not even talking about the senility issue. We're talking about like out of touch.
Oh, well, sure, being out of touch, yeah.
So what I want to know is there science fiction that portrays age as wisdom? Or is that a fantasy trope?
Ah, interesting.
So I'm going to answer my own question slightly, which is that Lois McMaster Bujold has been dealing with issues of aging, qua aging, pretty much since she started writing the Verkosigan stories. And I find her handling of aging really fascinating, but I'm finding her handling of aging fascinating from outside the actual frame of aging. So I'm wondering what it's going to look like to me in 10 years, as opposed to what it looks like to me now. Because there are things that she talks about later in life motherhood that I do have some grounding in, and I have my quibbles. But I also appreciate the portrayal at all. And she is writing Cordelia Verkosigan at the end, you know, later in life. But
also her Five Gods books really talk about aging well for fantasy.
Yeah. Which is why I'm looking, and I think fantasy is where we're working this out more.
The one example that I can think of in mainstream film is the oddest film in decades, which is Boyhood. Rick Linklater. It was it's amazing. It is about a kid going from 6 to 18, filmed over 12 years. And so the cast came back for like a long weekend once a year and filmed every year for over a decade. And the lead actor went from 6 years old to 18 years old. And the character, I think it's Ethan Hawke is the dad. And his character in particular becomes wise over those 12 years. Like he's really frivolous at the start of the movie, and he gains wisdom from experience and is able to impart some of that wisdom to his son in the course of the 12 years that the movie takes place.
Thank you for the recommendation. I now have it in my queue.
Yeah. Boyhood.
Cool.
It's an amazing film.
I've seen quite a number of contexts in which people have experimented with reversing aging or stopping aging in particular ways. I'm thinking of The Dying Man by, oh shoot, what's that guy's name? He was one of the original Sufwa guys. I'm going to have to enlist Google to be my friend.
You keep talking about what the context is and I will Google.
Well, so basically it's this society where everybody has stopped aging. They just sort of live forever. And so there's sort of no seriousness or permanence to anything in the society until this one guy suddenly one day starts aging. And what happens to him, and you know, he starts trying to make art and leave a stamp on the world, and it's a really interesting story. I'm just blanking on the name.
You said The Dying Man?
Yeah.
I'm not finding anything under that except for maybe a song by Father John Misty. I don't know
Well,
that
I
that's
think
what...
it was retitled, which it doesn't help.
Yeah, sorry.
Why don't you put it in the show notes if you find it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that we do have characters that are confronting death from old age. We do talk about the issue of what happens if you stop aging.
Damon Knight.
Right, of course. And we talk about what does it mean to deal with mortality.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that they're not about living with age.
Yeah.
They are about dying.
Yeah.
And I am reaching a point where I am more interested in finding roadmaps to living with age. And so I find myself looking at mainstream television more because, again, thank you, boomers. I'm wondering if the issue is that the publishing industry is not looking for those books, or if I'm just not getting recommendations. So I don't know.
I think those books would be more just regular literature rather than genre fiction.
Is that because we assume that the future will take away the issues of living with an aging body?
Certainly could be.
One of the best genre aging films, which came from a short story, I think, by Joe Lansdale, is Bubba Hotep. It's all about Elvis dealing with aging to the point where he is no longer a sex symbol, and how that core identity affects him. And also there's an ancient Egyptian mummy come to life who wears a cowboy hat, but this is the titular Bubba Hotep.
There was a movie set in Florida about Cocoon.
Yeah.
Yes. Cocoon, good one, yeah.
But, Cocoon ends up being a story about what happens if you're old and you are offered the chance to rejuvenate.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is more about what do you do when you're old and your core identity is you are Mr. Sexy who is desirable.
Yeah.
Right? And that's no longer at all the case. So
yeah.
Stephen King has written some books from the point of view of older and aging protagonists. Insomnia, I think one of his most underrated books and one of my personal favorites, had I forgot how old the man was, but he was definitely kind of senior citizen. And then it wasn't quite an aging character, but it was a young woman, needful things, but severe arthritis, and a lot of point of view what some things she was doing for like pain alleviation for her arthritis. I forgot what specific kind it was. I'm not even sure he said, but it was one of those that you get when you're younger, like rheumatoid arthritis or something. So,
well, this is really interesting because one of the things that I hadn't thought of saying before this point, but I think about it relatively often, is how aging is tied to health, right? And
sure,
when aging people gradually withdraw from society on to a large extent, it's because of health problems. So
some of it's mobility issues as well.
Yeah. Now, obviously, that's not exclusive to aging people.
But it's not even just that. Like, some have had like their driver's licenses, and so they can't drive or they shouldn't be driving. But then, who do they turn to drive them places? Do they have any will? Some of it's almost forced isolationism. the word.
Well, that's also a bigger deal in, you know, mid 20th century to early 21st century U.S. culture, because we became I'm trying to talk. We became an automobile culture.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that if you're living in a city where everything is walking distance, then it's not quite as isolating to lose the ability to drive. Or if you're living in a society in which everyone has driverless vehicles, which seems like, you know, going to be mid to late 21st century, that issue is gone again.
But see, so that's kind of interesting too, because a lot of people might posit a driverless car society and yet not think through the implications of that for the presence of older people in public life.
So really the discussion we're having right now is the ways that the assumption of useful able-bodiedness
Mm-hmm.
is detrimental to all sorts of people.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the thing that a lot of disability rights activists and accessibility activists have been emphasizing a lot. And I think we're going to see a lot of motion here, is that everybody, barring unforeseen early death, faces an end of diminished capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Except for the very, very exceptional few who don't. And so we really need to build a more accessible world. And I find it fascinating.
And you know who'll do it? The boomers will do it.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
boomers will demand it, and it will be up to everybody else if we can actually fund it, because apparently right now funding is what we all look at. So is this what actually gets us better taxation and redistribution? I don't know. I think that what we're expecting right now is that if you are rich and aging and losing capacity, that you are able to build yourself and buy yourself stair climbing apparatus and deliveries and drivers and all these other things. So I find it interesting, though, that we didn't build a more accessible world before now.
Yeah. Well, we
the old have been among us.
Very slowly.
So.
Very, very slowly.
Yeah.
I mean, the ADA was a big deal.
Yeah.
Right? That's had a lot of positive effects.
Yeah. So I think that we are right at the cusp of interesting times, assuming that we come back from this shutdown. I am really wondering what this show looks like in a year as we look back at this particular episode, because we're in the middle of all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Hello, future selves. We were really wondering whether or not we were going to recover from this shutdown right now. As I time capsule this episode.
Yep, absolutely. Well, it's 5 o'clock. I hate to say it.
Oh my goodness, that was fast.
Well, I mean,
we've only aged an hour.
But
time travel, the only reliable way, forward and slowly.
How did that happen? We traveled through time.
To quote a boomer, time keeps on slipping into the future.
That's right. So why don't we do this? Why don't we say, gosh, you guys are awesome. Thank you for being here for the first show of the year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
I love
it. Happy.
I can now say that I have a novel coming out next year.
Woo!
2020.
But what?
2020 then.
2020. That's when it's coming out.
It's really exciting.
Yeah. So, but anyway, sorry. When we started talking about the New Year, I was like, well, I would give you my little thing. But so I need to tell you that next week we will be meeting on Thursday to accommodate the schedule of Ellen Clagis, who will be coming to talk about her novella Passing Strange.
Yay!
Which is in the queer culture in San Francisco in the 1940s with magic.
I can actually just manage to arrive for that, yes.
Well, so anyway, it should be really amazing. And I hope you guys can be here. And I hope anybody watching can also be here, because it's going to be really cool. This is a really cool novella. And Ellen Clagis is able to be incredibly, incredibly entertaining, as we know from having heard the Scary Ham story. So
how soon do these go live on your channel?
They go live within about an hour.
Okay. So in that case, I will see people who are at Erasure this weekend. I have a whole whack of interesting panels that I'm on, and I will be doing a reading on Sunday morning.
Cool.
So hope to see you there.
Yay.
And also, I'm going to put in a back end of the show plug for Writing the Other, because I cannot say enough good things about the things that you will learn by participating. And whenever people come to me and ask me, Kat, you do all this cultural competency and cultural guiding and all this other stuff, what can I do? What can I do? And I always tell them, go take Writing the Other. So, hey, look, if you are Patreon or whatever else and affiliated, Juliet has found you a discount. So go
forth, write the other, get some knowledge. All right, thanks so much for being here. I'll stop the broadcast.